The pain came in waves that crested and broke against Seraphina's consciousness, each contraction more powerful than the last. She gripped the wooden frame of the birthing bed until her knuckles turned white, her copper gold hair plastered to her forehead with sweat, and tried to remember how to breathe. 12 hours of labor had worn her down to something raw and primal, a creature of instinct and endurance, and still the baby had not come. Rain lashed against the high windows of the birthing chamber, and thunder rolled across the mountains like the voice of angry gods. Marta's calloused hands pressed against her belly, measuring the position of the child within. The midwife had been delivering babies in Coldwell Lands for 40 years, her capable hands having guided hundreds of lives into the world, and her face betrayed nothing of what she found. But her eyes, when they met Seraphina's, held a warmth that felt like the only kindness left in the world. The older woman dipped a cloth in cool water and pressed it to Seraphina's brow, murmuring reassurances that the labor was progressing well, that the baby would come when it was ready, that she had seen 1,000 births and would see 1,000 more. The chamber itself was modest by noble standards, a stone room with a single high window and a fire burning low in the hearth. Candles guttered in iron brackets, casting shadows that danced and wavered with each gust of wind that found its way through the gaps in the stonework. The wooden birthing bed dominated the center of the room, surrounded by basins of water and piles of clean linens, and the air smelled of copper and sweat and the herbal tea Marta had been pressing on her for hours. Seraphina asked again where Brennan was. The question had become a rhythm of its own, asked after every third or fourth contraction, and each time the servants exchanged glances that answered more than their evasive words. Lord Brennan was occupied. Lord Brennan had been called away. Lord Brennan would come when he could. The excuses varied, but the truth beneath them remained constant. Her mate of 2 years had not seen fit to attend the birth of their child. She had made excuses for him throughout the pregnancy. Brennan was busy with the affairs of his lands. Brennan found pregnancy distasteful, as many men did. Brennan would come around once the child was born, once there was something tangible to love, rather than a swelling belly that made her slow and awkward. She had believed these things because the alternative was unbearable, because admitting she had bound herself to a man who cared nothing for her would mean admitting her entire life had been a mistake. The third daughter of a minor noble family, Seraphina had counted herself fortunate when Lord Brennan Coldwell chose her as his mate. She had been young, barely 20, with nothing to recommend her but a pleasant face and a knowledge of herbs inherited from her grandmother. Her father had remarried after her mother's death, and his new wife had made clear that Seraphina was competition for resources, an obstacle to be removed at the earliest opportunity. Marriage to a lord, even a minor one, had seemed like salvation. For 2 years she had worked to make herself indispensable. She learned every remedy and herb, managing the household with quiet efficiency, building a life from the scraps of affection Brennan occasionally threw her way. She had drunk the bitter herbal tea his housekeeper prepared each morning without question, assuming it was merely for her health. Though something about the combination of ingredients had nagged at her trained mind, she told herself that his coldness was reserve, that his distance was dignity, that the way he looked through her, rather than at her, was simply the manner of nobles. She told herself these lies because the alternative was too painful to face. Another contraction seized her, the most powerful yet, and Seraphina threw her head back and screamed. The sound tore from her throat before she could contain it, echoing off the stone walls of the birthing chamber. When the wave passed, leaving her gasping and trembling, she heard boots in the corridor outside. Heavy, purposeful steps that could only belong to one person. Relief flooded through her exhausted body, so intense it brought tears to her eyes. He had come. Whatever his faults, whatever distance had grown between them, Brennan had come. The door opened and her mate stepped into the candlelight. Lord Brennan Coldwell was a handsome man, with wheat-colored hair and pale blue eyes set in features that knew how to arrange themselves into whatever emotion served his purposes. He was dressed in fine wool despite the late hour, every thread proclaiming wealth and status, and he stood in the doorway without approaching the bed. The expression on his face was not concern or relief or the joy of an expectant father. It was something cold and calculated, something that made Seraphina's blood run colder than the stone walls surrounding her. He spoke without preamble, his voice carrying clearly over her labored breathing. The words were formal, ritualistic, drawn from ancient pack law that most believed had fallen out of use centuries ago. Before these witnesses, I renounce my claim upon Seraphina of House Ashworth. She is no mate of mine. Seraphina's world fractured. Another contraction was building, the pressure in her lower body demanding attention, but the words kept coming like blows. Brennan declared that the child she carried was not his, had never been his, was the product of infidelity and deception. He invoked the right of rejection, the ancient law that allowed a mate to sever the bond and cast out the offending party. He declared her packless, homeless, stripped of every protection his name had once provided. His voice never wavered, never cracked, as if he were reciting terms of a business arrangement rather than destroying the life of the woman who had borne his cruelty for 2 years. Marta surged forward, putting herself between the bed and the door, her stout body blocking Brennan's path. Her voice rose sharp with fury as she invoked the sanctity of the birthing chamber, citing ancient law that protected a laboring mother from harm. Even executions were delayed until after the birth, she reminded him. Even criminals were granted that much mercy. But Brennan only smiled, that cold smile that Seraphina had once mistaken for mysterious, and explained that he was causing no harm. He was merely exercising his legal right. The child would be born packless, fatherless, without claim to Coldwell name or lands. What happened to mother and child after that was not his concern. His pale eyes swept over Seraphina as if she were already gone, already erased from his life and his thoughts. The contraction hit, and Seraphina screamed, but whether from pain or anguish she could not have said. The two had become indistinguishable, her body tearing itself apart while her heart did the same. Through the haze of agony, she heard Brennan ordering everyone out, declaring that the child could be born in the stables where packless creatures belonged. She heard Marta shouting defiance, heard servants weeping, heard the chaos of a household turned upon itself. She understood, in that moment, what Brennan had done. He had timed the rejection precisely, waiting until labor was too advanced to stop, until witnesses could confirm the child was born after rejection. The baby would have no legal claim to anything, no protection, no future, and Seraphina would be cast out, a rejected mate with a bastard child, ruined beyond any possibility of recovery. And then, somehow, she found her voice. "You will not touch my child." The words cut through the noise, carrying an authority Seraphina had not known she possessed. Everyone fell silent, even Brennan, momentarily startled by the steel in her tone. She pushed herself up on trembling arms, green eyes finding her former mate through the sweat and tears that blurred her vision. "Marta will continue. My daughter will be born here, in a proper chamber, attended by a proper midwife. You may do whatever you wish to me after, but you will not lay one hand on my child." Brennan's face contorted with rage, but before he could respond, horns sounded from the courtyard below. The household froze, recognizing the significance of that call. A royal banner had been spotted. The Alpha King's traveling party was approaching the gates of Coldwell Manor on this night of all nights. Seraphina watched the color drain from Brennan's face and felt something like satisfaction pierce through her pain. He had not expected company for his private cruelty. Whatever calculations had led him to this moment, he had not accounted for witnesses of such significance. His scheme had been designed for shadows, for the quiet disposal of a woman no one would miss. The arrival of royalty changed everything. Later, Marta would speak of fate, of the old gods arranging coincidences to deliver justice. A thrown horseshoe, a storm, a king seeking shelter at precisely this manor on precisely this night. The probability defied reason, but sometimes the universe conspired to expose what darkness wished to hide. In the courtyard below, Darius Stormborn dismounted from his warhorse and surveyed Coldwell Manor with the weary irritation of a man whose schedule had been disrupted. A thrown horseshoe had delayed them by hours, forcing them to seek shelter for the night, rather than pressing on to the capital as planned. Rain soaked through his cloak and plastered his black hair to his forehead, and his mood matched the storm. Commander Fenris directed the servants who rushed to attend them, his scarred face unreadable in the torchlight. He had served as the Alpha King's right hand for 12 years, his loyalty forged in the fires of 3 wars and 1 devastating loss, and he knew his liege's moods better than anyone. Darius wanted nothing more than a hot meal and a dry bed, and these minor nobles with their provincial hospitality would likely provide neither to his satisfaction. Lord Brennan appeared at the manor's entrance, all smiles and deference, apologizing for the poor timing of their arrival and promising every comfort. Darius noted the man's fine clothes, his polished manner, his carefully constructed charm, and felt an instinctive wariness he could not quite explain. He had met many such nobles in his years on the throne, men whose surfaces gleamed while their depths held rot. There was something in Brennan's eyes, a calculation poorly hidden, that set his teeth on edge. A scream echoed from the upper windows. Raw, agonized, unmistakably, a woman in the throes of labor. Darius felt the sound pierce through him like a blade. For a moment he was not standing in a stranger's courtyard, but in his own palace, 3 years ago, hearing Lyanna's screams as she struggled to bring forth their child. He had been too far away to reach her in time, delayed by an assassin's treachery, and by the time he arrived, there was only blood and silence, and a world that would never be the same. The memory hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath, rooting him to the muddy ground. He demanded to know what was happening. Brennan dismissed the question with a wave of his hand, explaining that it was merely a servant giving birth, nothing to concern a king. But the quality of that scream had been wrong, the voice too cultured, the cry carrying the timbre of education and breeding. Fenris met his eyes and gave an almost imperceptible nod, confirming the same assessment. No servant screamed with that particular cadence of authority. Darius strode into the manor without invitation. Brennan scrambled to follow, still talking, still explaining, still weaving a narrative designed to minimize and deflect. The great hall was lit by flickering candles, servants standing in uneasy clusters, the entire household clearly disturbed by something they dared not name. The tension in the air was thick enough to taste, fear and confusion mingling with the smell of wood smoke and wet stone. The king ignored the wine that was pressed into his hands, his attention fixed on the ceiling, on the sounds still filtering down from above. Another scream echoed through the manor, and he felt it in his bones, felt the pull of something he did not understand and could not resist. He questioned the staff directly, bypassing Brennan's attempts at misdirection. At first they hesitated, terrified of contradicting their lord, their eyes darting between the king and their master. But royal authority carried its own weight, its own compulsion. A frightened maid finally broke, her words tumbling out in a rush of horror and disbelief. It was the lady who screamed. Lord Brennan had rejected her. During the labor, he had spoken the words of severance while she pushed to bring forth his child. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the storm seemed to pause, thunder holding its breath. Darius turned to Brennan, and something in his face made the lord step back, his polished composure finally cracking beneath the weight of royal fury. "You did what?" The words came out as a growl, something primal and lupine threading through the king's voice. His eyes flashed amber for a heartbeat, the wolf beneath the surface rising in response to such cruelty. The servants who witnessed it would later swear they saw the king's shadow shift, taking on a shape that was not entirely human. Brennan stumbled back, his wolf instincts recognizing the superior predator before him. He attempted justification, his words coming faster now, tangling over themselves in their haste to escape. The child was not his. She had trapped him. He had every right under ancient law. The Alpha King had no jurisdiction over matters between mates. His voice rose higher with each excuse, each rationalization, each attempt to make his cruelty sound reasonable. But Darius was no longer listening. He was already moving toward the stairs, taking them two at a time, following the sounds of pain and chaos to their source. Behind him, Fenris barked orders, securing the manor, ensuring no one left until the king determined what had happened here. The household staff pressed against walls as the Alpha King passed, recognizing the fury in his stride. The birthing chamber door stood open, revealing a scene of controlled pandemonium. A gray-haired midwife crouched at the foot of the bed, her bloodied hands steady despite the chaos surrounding her. Her voice remained calm as she guided a woman through the final stages of labor, issuing instructions with the authority of 4 decades of experience. That woman lay gasping against sweat-soaked sheets, her copper-gold hair wild around a face contorted with effort. She was beautiful despite the exhaustion, despite the pain, despite the tears that streaked her cheeks. And when her green eyes met Darius's across the chaos, he felt something shift in his chest, something that had been frozen for 3 years beginning to crack. His wolf, dormant for so long, stirred with an intensity he had not felt since Lyanna, not claiming, not demanding, but recognizing something in this stranger that called to the deepest part of his nature. The midwife shouted that the baby was crowning, that she needed help rather than interruptions, and Darius found himself rooted to the threshold, unable to advance or retreat. The woman on the bed pushed, her scream rising to a peak that seemed to shake the very stones of the manor. And then a new sound joined the cacophony, the thin, furious wail of a newborn taking its first breath. Brennan burst in behind him, demanding that the king leave this private matter alone, citing protocols and precedents and ancient rites. But Darius barely heard him. He was watching the midwife lift a squalling infant, was watching her place the child on the mother's chest, was watching the woman's face transform from anguish to wonder as she looked upon her daughter for the first time. The words left his mouth before conscious thought could intervene. Ancient words, formal words, drawn from the same pack law that Brennan had twisted to his purposes. I claim this woman and her child under the king's shield. They are under my protection from this moment forward, and any who threaten them answer to me. The room fell silent except for the baby's cries. Brennan's face went gray with shock, the calculated expression finally shattering into something like fear. The midwife looked up, her weathered face caught between hope and disbelief. And the woman on the bed, exhausted beyond measure, met Darius's eyes with a question she lacked the strength to voice. He approached the bed slowly, as one might approach a wild thing that might bolt at any sudden movement. The baby was red-faced and furious, tiny fists waving against the unfairness of the world, perfectly healthy despite the circumstances of her birth. He looked at her, at this life that had entered the world surrounded by cruelty and chaos, and felt something long frozen begin to thaw. "She is beautiful," he said, and then, softer, meant only for the mother. "I will not let him hurt either of you. Whatever comes next, you are not alone." The woman's eyes filled with tears, but she did not weep. She simply held her daughter closer and said nothing at all, and Darius understood that words meant nothing to her now. Only actions would prove his intent. Dawn came gray and cold, the storm having passed in the night, leaving the world washed and exhausted. Serafina lay in a proper bed for the first time since the ordeal began, her daughter sleeping against her breast, her body aching in ways she had not known were possible. Marta had tended to her through the night, cleaning and stitching and administering herbs for the pain, and now the midwife dozed in a chair by the fire, her gray head nodding with each breath. The king's men had taken control of the manor. Brennan had been confined to his chambers under guard, his protests falling on deaf ears. The household staff moved through their duties in a daze, uncertain what this upheaval meant for their futures, speaking in whispers when they spoke at all. And somewhere in the chaos, decisions were being made that would determine the course of Serafina's life. A knock came at the door, soft but purposeful, and Darius Stormborn entered. He looked different in daylight, less like a figure from legend, and more like a man who had slept poorly. Lines of exhaustion carved themselves around his pale gray eyes, and the scar across his throat, a remnant, she would later learn, of the same assassination attempt that had taken his mate and child, stood stark against his skin. He carried no crown, wore no finery, presented himself as simply a man come to check on a woman and child under his protection. He asked how she was feeling, and she answered honestly, terrible, but alive. He asked about the baby, and she showed him how peacefully Rosalind slept, unaware of the chaos that had attended her birth. He asked what she needed, and she had no answer, because she did not know what was possible anymore. He offered her a choice. She could remain at Coldwell Manor, protected by royal decree but close to everything familiar, or she could travel with him to the capital and build an entirely new life. Both options carried risks, he admitted. Remaining here meant proximity to Brennan, to his anger and his schemes. Traveling so soon after birth was inadvisable, potentially dangerous for both mother and child. He would support whichever decision she made. Serafina looked at the chamber where she had been rejected, where she had screamed her daughter into the world while her mate spoke words of dissolution. She thought of the years she had spent here, building a life from scraps of affection, convincing herself that security was enough. She thought of raising her daughter in the shadow of Brennan's spite, of watching that beautiful face learn to navigate her father's contempt. "I will go with you," she said. "I will not raise my child in his shadow." The decision was made before she could second-guess herself, and something in the king's expression softened with what might have been relief. The journey to Stormhold took 3 days, with frequent stops to allow Serafina to rest and nurse. She traveled in a cushioned litter, her daughter warm against her chest, watching the forested mountains pass through gaps in the curtains. The king rode beside her more often than protocol demanded, his guards exchanging meaningful glances that he either did not notice or chose to ignore. They spoke during those long hours, carefully at first, feeling out the boundaries of this strange new connection. He asked about her life before Brennan, about the family she had come from, about the skills she had developed in her years as a minor noble's third daughter. She learned that he valued competence, that he listened more than he spoke, that he asked questions no one had bothered to ask in years. He seemed genuinely interested in her answers, not merely making conversation to pass the time. She caught him watching her with her daughter, an expression of such naked pain crossing his face that she had to look away. The intensity of it frightened her, suggested depths of grief she could not fathom. That night, while the camp settled into quiet, she overheard 2 guards speaking in hushed tones by the fire, unaware that sound carried differently in the mountain air. The king had lost his mate, his child, 3 years ago. An assassination attempt had claimed them both while Darius was too far away to intervene. He had not been the same since, one guard said quietly. He had closed himself off, refused all proposals of mating, buried himself in the work of ruling as if hoping to outrun his grief. Understanding shifted Serafina's perception of everything. The king's protection was not purely political, not simply a matter of pack law invoked for advantage. He was trying to save something he had failed to save before. She did not know whether to find that reassuring or terrifying, perhaps both. She named her daughter on the second day of travel, as they rested beside a stream where the water ran clear and cold over smooth stones. Rosalind, for the wild roses that had grown in her mother's garden, the one beautiful thing from her childhood that had not been tainted by later pain. Darius heard the name and something softened in his expression, though he did not comment. That night, after the camp had settled into quiet, Seraphina caught him standing at the edge of the firelight, staring at the stars with an expression of such loneliness that her heart ached despite herself. Stormhold rose from the heart of the capital city like a fortress built by giants. Gray stone towers pierced the winter sky, iron gates stood ready to seal against any threat, and guards in black armor watched from every battlement. The city spread around it in ever-widening circles, more people in one place than Seraphina had ever seen, their eyes turning to follow the royal party as it passed through the streets. The palace itself was overwhelming. Vast halls lined with tapestries depicting centuries of history. Corridors that seemed to stretch forever, lit by windows of colored glass. Staircases worn smooth by generations of footsteps. Nobles gathered to witness her arrival, their gazes ranging from curious to skeptical to openly hostile. The whispers preceded her through every chamber. The king has returned with a woman and child, claimed under the shield, a rejected mate from a minor house. Darius led her personally to chambers in the royal wing, ignoring the murmurs of his court. The rooms were larger than the entirety of her family home, furnished with silk hangings and carved furniture, a fire already burning in the hearth to ward off the winter chill. A cradle had been prepared, lined with velvet, waiting for her daughter as if someone had known she would come. "Rest," he said. "Recover your strength. When you are ready, we will discuss what comes next." Alone with Rosalind, Seraphina allowed herself to shake. The weeks that followed blurred together in a haze of recovery and adjustment. Seraphina's body healed slowly, her strength returning in increments, her mind struggling to process the magnitude of change her life had undergone. She was no longer a lady of Coldwell Manor, no longer a mate with standing, no longer anything she had been raised to be. She was under the king's shield, which meant she was protected. But protection was not identity. Protection did not tell her who she was. The court regarded her with suspicion. She was an anomaly, a disruption to the careful hierarchies they had spent years constructing. Some saw her as a curiosity, others as a threat, still others as an opportunity to be cultivated or exploited. Anonymous letters began appearing under her door, warning her to leave, threatening consequences for the pretender who had bewitched their king. She burned them without responding, but the knowledge that someone in the palace wanted her gone settled into her bones like cold. She found purpose in the healing halls. The palace physician was elderly, his hands no longer steady, his memory sometimes unreliable. When Seraphina offered assistance, demonstrating her knowledge of herbs and remedies, he accepted with relief that bordered on desperation. Her years of training became valuable, her expertise earning respect that her status could not command. She worked long hours, mixing poultices and administering tonics, and for brief moments she forgot to be afraid. Commander Fenris brought her news of Brennan's machinations. Her former mate had not abandoned his campaign. He was petitioning the regional councils to have the rejection legitimized, to have her status as a packless woman confirmed beyond any royal intervention. He claimed she had seduced the king with lies, had fabricated the circumstances of the rejection, had somehow manipulated events to her advantage through forbidden arts. The accusations were absurd to anyone who had witnessed that night, but witnesses could be bought, could be intimidated, could be silenced. Seraphina began her own investigation, though she had never done anything of the sort before. She had overheard a conversation in the healing halls, hushed voices speaking of information being passed to Coldwell, of someone in the palace feeding intelligence to Brennan's agents. She did not report this to the king, not yet. She wanted to understand the shape of the conspiracy before she acted, wanted to have something concrete rather than suspicions. Years of being overlooked had taught her how to be invisible when she wished. She traced connections carefully, noting who spoke to whom, who received letters from the south, who seemed too interested in her movements. Servants spoke freely around a woman mixing poultices. Nobles dismissed the healer's assistant as beneath notice. The same invisibility that had made her years with Brennan so lonely now became her greatest asset. The work gave her something to focus on beyond her grief and fear, a puzzle to solve, a problem that had an answer. She had spent too many years being passive, accepting whatever scraps she was given. She would not make that mistake again. The king sought her out in the evenings. Their conversations began as practical matters, questions about her recovery, about Rosalind's health, about her work in the healing halls. But as the weeks passed, the topics drifted, becoming more personal, more honest. He spoke of his childhood in these very halls, of a demanding father who saw kingship as burden rather than privilege. He spoke of the brother he had lost in a border skirmish years before his mate's death, the first crack in a world that would later shatter entirely. She spoke of her mother, of the loneliness of being the overlooked daughter, of the desperation that had led her to accept Brennan's courtship despite every warning. One evening, in the private garden where Seraphina had taken to walking when Rosalind slept, Darius spoke of Lyanna. He told her about meeting his mate at a treaty negotiation, about the way she had argued politics with a ferocity that left diplomats speechless. He told her about their courtship, the slow building of trust, the way she had challenged him to be better than he believed he could be. He told her about their mating ceremony, about the joy of learning she was with child, about the plans they had made for a future that would never come. And then he told her about the assassin who had struck while Darius was leading troops at the northern border, about the poisoned blade that had seemed a minor wound until infection set in. He told her about riding for 3 days without rest, about arriving home to find blood and silence, about holding his mate's cold hand while his child lay still in its cradle. Seraphina listened without interruption. When he finished, when the words had finally run dry, she shared her own grief. The mother who had died when she was young, the father who had remarried a woman who saw his daughter as competition, the years of feeling unseen and undervalued. They sat together in the garden's darkness, two wounded people recognizing something in each other that words could not quite capture. His hand brushed hers on the cold stone of the bench, and neither pulled away. "I do not know what I want from you," he admitted, his voice rough with emotion. "Only that I cannot imagine this palace without you now." She told him she was not ready for what he might be asking, but she was not refusing either. It was the most honest thing she had ever said, and something in his expression told her he understood. The winter feast was in full swing when the herald announced an unexpected guest. The great hall blazed with candles and rang with music, nobles in their finest celebrating the solstice with food and wine and intrigue. Seraphina sat at the high table beside the king, wearing a gown of deep green silk that the palace seamstress had crafted for her, Rosalind in the nursery with trusted attendants. She had begun to feel something like belonging, like the first tentative shoots of possibility pushing through frozen ground. And then Brennan Coldwell strode into the hall. He approached the high table with calculated humility, every line of his body designed to present him as the wounded party seeking reconciliation. He begged audience with the king, his voice carrying through the sudden silence that had fallen over the feast. He spoke of enchantment, of bewitchment, of herbs and potions that had clouded his judgment and led him to terrible actions. He claimed Seraphina had manipulated him, had used her knowledge of healing to poison his mind, had orchestrated the entire rejection for purposes he still did not understand. He demanded she be returned to him, along with his daughter, so he might make amends for the wrong he had unknowingly committed. His pale eyes found her across the hall, and she saw the hatred beneath his humble mask, the rage that had driven him here to reclaim what he had discarded. Seraphina rose from her place at the table. The hall held its breath, hundreds of nobles watching, waiting to see how she would respond to this assault on everything she had built. She spoke calmly, clearly, each word carrying the weight of truth and the precision of someone who had prepared for this moment. She recounted the rejection in precise detail, the timing, the words, the cruelty of speaking them during active labor. She named witnesses who could confirm her account: Marta the midwife, the household servants, the guards who had heard everything through the chamber door. She described the years of cold treatment that had preceded that night, the careful distance Brennan had maintained, the herbal teas, whose true purpose she had finally confirmed in the palace healing halls, tansy and pennyroyal and queen's lace, herbs meant to prevent conception that she had drunk unknowingly for 2 years. She presented the threatening letters, the evidence she had gathered, the connection she had traced between Brennan's agents and a palace servant who had been passing information. She spoke not as a victim pleading for justice, but as an investigator presenting a case, her voice never wavering, her gaze never dropping from her former mate's face. The woman who had been too frightened to speak 3 months ago was gone. In her place stood someone who had found her voice and refused to be silenced. Brennan's composure cracked, the pleasant mask he had worn for so long shattered, revealing the rage beneath. He lunged toward her, shouting that she was worthless, that she had always been worthless, that she should have died in that birthing chamber where she belonged. His handsome face twisted into something ugly, and the court that had dismissed her saw at last the beast behind the polished surface. Royal guards intercepted him before he could reach her. His arms were pinned, his fury impotent, his true nature exposed before the entire realm. The nobles who had doubted Seraphina's account saw the violence in his eyes, heard the hatred in his voice, and she watched their expressions shift from skepticism to horror. Darius rose from his throne, and his voice carried like thunder through the silent hall. Lord Brennan Coldwell, you stand accused of rejection without cause, of conspiracy against a woman under royal protection, of lying before your king. You will be held for judgment, and your lands will answer for your crimes. They took him away, still struggling, still shouting accusations that no one believed. Seraphina found Darius in his private chambers after the feast had dissolved into chaos. He stood before the fire, his back to the door, and she could see the tension in his shoulders, the weight of everything that had transpired. The candles had burned low, and the shadows stretched long across the stone floor. Brennan will face exile, he said, without turning. Stripped of lands and title, he will spend his remaining years in the frozen north, contemplating his choices. Coldwell Manor and its territories will revert to the crown, administered by a steward until such time as Rosalind comes of age, if she wishes to claim her birthright. If not, they will remain crown lands. Either way, the people there will be cared for. She approached him slowly, stopping an arm's length away. And what happens to me now? He turned, and she saw something vulnerable in his expression, something the court never witnessed, something she suspected few living people had ever seen. The Alpha King knelt before her, this woman he had claimed from a birthing bed, his pale gray eyes looking up at her with an emotion she was only beginning to name. That depends entirely on you, he said. You may stay or go with my full support in either path. I will provide lands, an income, everything you need to build a life wherever you choose. You owe me nothing, Seraphina. The shield was given freely, and it carries no obligation. She looked at him, This scarred king who had lost everything and found the courage to reach for something again. She thought of the months they had spent in careful circles around each other, the walls they had both built, the terrifying possibility of letting someone in after being broken. "I choose to stay," she said. And then, before he could respond, "But on my terms." "Name them." "I am no one's afterthought. I am no one's second choice, no one's replacement for someone else. If you want me, want all of me. Want me for myself, not for who you lost. Or let me go and never speak of this again." He reached up, took her hands in his, and she felt the calluses on his palms, the warmth of his skin, the steadiness that had seen him through war and grief, and the slow work of rebuilding a broken world. "Leanna was my past," he said, and his voice did not waver. "You are my choice, not because you fill the space she left, but because you have carved a space of your own. I am not looking for a replacement. I am looking for a future." She leaned down, and their foreheads touched, breath mingling in the firelight. "Then we build something new," she said. "Together." He rose and kissed her, a gentle meeting of lips that asked nothing and promised everything. When they parted, she saw the hope in his eyes, fragile and fierce all at once, and she realized she had never seen him so unguarded. The Alpha King, terror of battlefields and master of politics, stood before her with his heart in his hands, waiting to see if she would accept it. She did. The weeks that followed were unlike anything Seraphina had experienced. Darius did not crowd her, did not demand more than she was ready to give, but his presence became a constant in her life. He visited her in the healing halls, watching with genuine interest as she prepared remedies. He walked with her through the gardens when Rosalind needed fresh air. He sat with her in the evenings, reading or talking or simply existing in comfortable silence. The court watched this development with a mixture of fascination and concern. Some nobles had hoped the king's protection was merely political, a gesture that would fade once the scandal died down. Others had assumed Seraphina would retreat from public life, content to remain a footnote in royal history. Instead, she became visible, valued, a presence that could not be ignored. She continued to work in the healing halls, developing new remedies and earning the respect of the palace physicians. Her knowledge of herbs, once dismissed as the hobby of a minor noble's daughter, proved invaluable. A fever swept through the servant quarters one bitter winter week, and Seraphina worked alongside the elderly physician to treat the afflicted. She saved lives, and word of her skill spread through the palace. Commander Fenris began to treat her differently, with a grudging respect that warmed into something like affection. He shared stories of battles long past, of the young prince who had become a warrior king, of the brother lost and the mate mourned. Through these conversations, Seraphina came to understand the weight of loss that Darius carried, and the magnitude of what he was offering her. Rosalind thrived in the palace, surrounded by nurses who adored her and servants who competed to make her laugh. She had her mother's green eyes and her father's determination, and she cried less often than any infant Marta had ever attended. The midwife had stayed through the winter, claiming she wanted to ensure both mother and daughter remained healthy, but everyone knew she had come to love them and could not bear to leave. The threats did not cease. Brennan's allies continued their campaign of whispers and innuendo, questioning Seraphina's virtue and Rosalind's parentage. Anonymous letters still appeared under her door, though now they threatened not just her, but the king who protected her. She brought each one to Darius, and together they traced the connections back to their source. The spy in the palace was discovered on a frozen February morning. A minor servant, overlooked and resentful, had been passing information to Brennan's agents for months. He was arrested, questioned, and banished to the same frozen wastes where his master would soon follow. Seraphina watched him led away and felt no satisfaction, only relief that one more threat had been neutralized. Spring came to Stormhold in a riot of color and warmth. The gardens bloomed with 100 varieties of flowers. The markets bustled with merchants from across the realm. And in the healing halls, Seraphina developed remedies that would save lives for generations to come. Rosalind grew strong and healthy, learning to smile, to reach for the faces of those who loved her green eyes bright with intelligence. The courtship proceeded slowly, deliberately, nothing like the desperate grasping that had characterized her years with Brennan. Darius gave her space to grow into herself, to discover who she was beyond the role she had been forced to play. She challenged him, questioned him, refused to let him retreat behind his crown when the intimacy frightened him. They argued about policy and philosophy, discovered shared interests and surprising differences, built something real, one conversation at a time. One evening, she found him in the library, struggling with a trade agreement that would affect the very farming communities she had grown up among. She pointed out 3 flaws in the proposal that his advisors had missed, practical concerns that only someone who had lived among common folk would recognize. He stared at her for a long moment, then asked her to stay and help him revise it. They worked until dawn, and somewhere in those hours, the distance between king and supplicant dissolved into something like partnership. Another night, Rosalind took her first stumbling steps across the nursery floor, and Seraphina looked up to find Darius watching from the doorway, tears on his cheeks that he made no effort to hide. She crossed to him without thinking, took his hand, and they stood together watching the little girl who had brought them both back from the edge of darkness. Their mating ceremony was held in the garden where they had first spoken honestly, beneath a canopy of flowering vines in the golden light of summer evening. It was a small affair, witnessed only by those who mattered. Commander Fenris standing stern and proud, the elderly physician who had become Seraphina's mentor. The midwife Marta, who had never left Stormhold since that fateful night, standing beside the woman she had helped through her darkest hour. Rosalind gurgled in her nurse's arms, and when Darius slipped the mating band onto Seraphina's finger, the little girl laughed as if she understood. The vows they spoke were traditional, words that had bound mates for centuries, but they carried a weight that transcended ritual. Seraphina promised to stand beside him, to challenge him, to love him even when he retreated behind his walls. Darius promised to see her, to value her, to never take for granted the gift she had given him. When the ceremony concluded, the garden erupted in applause, and Seraphina realized that the court that had once viewed her with suspicion had come to see her as their queen. The first year of their mating brought new challenges and unexpected joys. Seraphina took on formal duties, attending council meetings and representing the crown at diplomatic events. She brought her practical wisdom to discussions of policy, arguing for the poor and the overlooked, using her experience as a minor noble's forgotten daughter to advocate for those who had no voice. Darius watched her grow into her role with pride that he made no effort to hide. Rosalind spoke her first word on a spring morning, reaching for Darius with chubby hands and calling him by a name that sounded like Papa. The king, who had faced down armies without flinching, wept openly and declared it the finest moment of his reign. Seraphina watched them together, her daughter and the man who had claimed them both, and felt a peace she had never known was possible. The years that followed brought their own challenges, border disputes that required Darius's attention, a harsh winter that tested the realm's resources, the constant political maneuvering of nobles who had never quite accepted their queen's common origins. But they faced each trial together, and their partnership grew stronger with each obstacle overcome. Rosalind grew from a toddler into a bright, curious child, with her mother's green eyes and her stepfather's stubborn determination. She called him Papa without hesitation, and he loved her as fiercely as if she had been born of his own blood. 3 years after their mating in the birthing chamber of Stormhold Palace, Seraphina's pains came again. This time the room was warm and bright, filled with people who loved her, smelling of lavender and clean linen rather than fear and copper. This time, her mate was at her side from the first contraction, his hand gripping hers, his voice steady in her ear. This time, when she screamed, she knew she was not alone, would never be alone again. The son came easier than the daughter had, sliding into Marta's waiting hands with a cry that echoed off the stone walls. Darius cut the cord with trembling fingers, his gray eyes bright with tears he made no effort to hide. When the baby was placed on Seraphina's chest, she looked up at her mate and saw something she had never expected to see on the face of a warrior king: healing. "I was there for this one," he whispered, his voice breaking on the words. "I was there." She pulled him close, their son between them, their daughter waiting in the nursery down the hall to meet her brother. She thought of the woman she had been in that cold birthing chamber years ago, rejected and alone, knowing only that she would fight for her child. She thought of the choices she had made since, the agency she had claimed, the life she had built from the ruins of the one that was destroyed. "You were there," she agreed, "and you will be there for every moment that follows." Outside the window, the sun was rising over Stormhold, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. In the garden below, the roses were blooming.